Good morning and welcome to the Partnership for a Lead-Free Futures webinar on understanding sources of lead exposure. This is the first of 12 such webinars to be delivered approximately each month over the course of the next year. My name is Brett Erickson. I'm an environmental health consultant with UNICEF and will be emceeing today's event. Today's webinar will last 1 hour and is being recorded. It will be organized around 4 different talks, each addressing different aspects of lead exposure. First, Youth Ambassador Salah Abudu will talk about some of the work she and her group have been doing to educate communities on the health risks of lead exposure in Agbogbloshie, Accra, Ghana. Next, Mary Jean Brown of Harvard University will provide a brief primer on lead exposure globally. Amalia Laborde from the University of the Republic in Montevideo, Uruguay, will then describe measures the municipality of Montevideo took to map and remediate lead hotspot contamination around the city.
Hey, Kevin.
Oh, sorry, Mary Jean. If we can mute that microphone.
On the chair.
We can mute that. Thank you. Finally, Angela Bandemir of US EPA will provide an update on the tools that EPA is developing with UNICEF to help end childhood lead poisoning. We will move through each presentation before conducting a Q&A. Please leave any questions or comments in the chat window, and we will try to address them then. Without further ado, I would like to now introduce our first speaker. Salah Abudu is a third-year public health student at the University of Ghana School of Nursing and Midwifery. She is a youth leader and the president of Orange Girls Network, an organization made up of vulnerable female head potters who have migrated from northern parts of Ghana, commonly called Kayaye, who advocate for issues on rights and well-being of themselves and other marginalized girls who sleep in the markets. She is a former head potter herself, having slept on the streets and markets of Agbogbloshie. Salah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll be sharing my screen now. So, good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you, team. So, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. Thank you to UNICEF for this great honor of allowing me to share a youth perspective of a lead exposure during this 12th International Lead Poisoning Prevention Week. My name is Salah Abudu from Accra, Ghana. I represent the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform, the world's largest network of youth organizations and individuals engaged in policy development and action for a future free from hazardous chemicals, waste, and pollution. I recently completed my BSc, Bachelor of Science in Public Health Nursing, University of Ghana School of Nursing and Midwifery, focusing on environmental health and hygiene. Today, I would like to share with you my personal story and experiences with the scourge of lead contamination in my country and globally. And by so doing, I hope to have lifted the voices of children and youth like myself, calling for the elimination of lead exposure and poisoning in our community. When I was a teenager, I started at the age of 14. I worked for a small amount of money per day as a head porter. Head porter is popularly known as Kayaye in Ghana. For those unfamiliar with this term, this type of work, head porters are mostly adolescent girls and young women. So we carry loads on baskets and pans across the busy market in the pans on top of our heads in order to get paid. Sometimes these pans and baskets are heavier than our weight. And after the hard work day was done, I slept homelessly on the streets of Agbogbloshie. Agbogbloshie with its associated risks such as rape, infections, among others, and is also known to be a notorious dam site. That is known to be is known to be one of the largest scrapyards for e-waste, that is electronic waste, on the entire African continent and the world. And with a vast and uncontrolled amounts of e-waste being openly burned and dismantled. So too were vast and uncontrolled amounts of lead and other hazardous chemical exposures to children and adolescents in the slum. We inhaled all forms of gases and smoke emitting from the burnt e-waste. We inhaled gases and smokes emitting from the burnt of e-waste. Some of my colleagues, headquarters, and young local scrap dealers fell ill, including myself. I've had series of cuts from the e-waste. No child or teenager should have to be made sick merely because of the environment they live in, their poverty level, or any other status. I wanted to do something to secure a better future for myself and other youths working in these conditions so that all of us will live up to our potential, not sacrificing our bodies and brains to lead pollution in order to make ends meet and send money back to our families. I began working with support from the Pyrum African Youth Development Platform, a non-governmental organization that works with marginalized girls in Accra to teach Kaye proper waste management, environmental health and hygiene, livelihood skills and financial literacy. I conducted community-based programs and engaged the media in dialogue concerning the marginalized girls staying in toxic environments due to improper waste management. Pyrum African Youth Development Platform and the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, they supported me to pursue schooling in public health nursing to more effectively improve the well-being of my community. The health and rise of children and youth need to be amplified in global efforts to eliminate pollution and exposure. We must go further together. We must go further together. Let's progress made through initiatives like the Global Alliance Eliminate Lead Paint and the newly launched Partnership for a Lead-Free Future needs. It needs to be mainstreamed into broader global policy. Agenda on chemicals and waste, ensuring children's environmental health is consistently prioritized, monitored, and assessed across the full spectrum of toxic chemicals. Because the truth is, children and young people are rarely exposed to just one chemical at a time, which is the case in agriculture and many other unregulated areas across the globe. The work of the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future can set the model for child protective and child responsive environmental policies widely. Let's show the world what can be achieved when children are at the center. We must do this with and for youth. Children and youth constituencies and networks like the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform must be united together with the United Nations, governments, and all stakeholders in designing and implementing the work of the partnership. Education and outreach strategies need to be targeted to young people who are the most harmed but have been the least hurt. Myself and my fellow young people joining us on this event today are eager to take this week as a launch map to amplify our efforts and push for a lead-free future that prioritizes the well-being of every child and the young person. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Saad. Thank you very much. Our next presentation comes from Dr. Mary Jean Brown. And Mary Jean, while I'm introducing you, oh, perfect, you're bringing a presentation. Dr. Brown is on the faculty of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, where she teaches courses in public health practice. Dr. Brown works regularly with domestic and international public health organizations and non-governmental organizations, such as WHO and the World Bank, on issues related to health and housing, including developing policies to eliminate childhood lead poisoning. She has published more than 150 peer-reviewed and scientific articles, commentaries, and policy documents, and conducted epidemiological studies of housing interventions for lead, asthma, and injuries in the United States. Dr. Brown received her Doctor of Science degree from the Harvard School of Public Health in the year 2000. She received a Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree from Boston College in 1982. Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. This will be 69 years ago, René Dubois told us that the problem of childhood lead poisoning is so well defined, so neatly packaged with both causes and cures known, that if we don't eliminate this social crime, our society deserves all the disasters that have been forecast for it. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what lead exposure does, especially to children, how that affects children and their families and their communities and their countries, and how much it costs all of us. And so how important it is for us to take René Dubois' quote to heart and think about operationalizing it in our own lives. So the adverse effects of lead, blood lead levels as low as 2 micrograms per deciliter, are well documented and well understood. These impacts on intelligence, behavior, and attention not only affect the lead-exposed children, but have major impacts on their families and communities. Okay, I'm pushing the down key, Brett, but it's not going anywhere. I have to do this. Prenatal exposure is a predictor of developmental outcomes and other adverse effects later in life. Lead exposure compounds impacts of other factors that affect children's development, including poverty, poor nutrition, irregular education, etc. In this landmark study that was conducted in 1979 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, Herb Needleman, one of the broad shoulders on which we stand, looked at the lead level of baby teeth in children, over 2,000 children who had never had symptoms of lead poisoning. At this point in 1979, a child with a blood lead level of 50 micrograms per deciliter was considered fine. But when he was asked, when teachers were asked to evaluate these children's classroom performance, the frequency of non-adaptive behavior increased in a dose-related fashion, which to toxicologists says, the dose, the higher the dose, the worse the outcome. That's pretty indicative that it is actually the exposure. So if you look at this, you can see that the children with the highest tooth leads, that would be group 6, are more distractible. They can't follow simple directions well. They can't follow 3-step directions. Mary, go and get me a pencil, piece of paper, and a Kleenex, and she comes back with an orange and a box of Kleenex or something like that. And so these children were not doing well in school, and subsequent follow-ups of them continued to show that they were having adverse impacts on their activities of daily living for the next 40 years. The U.S. National Toxicology Program looked at the health effects of very low by historic measures effects of lead, and they found sufficient evidence. Now, these people at the NTP do not use the word sufficient lightly, but they found that blood lead levels less than 5, there was sufficient evidence that these health effects on IQ, academic performance, increased attention-related behaviors and problem behaviors. And they also found for blood lead levels less than 10, there was sufficient evidence of delayed puberty, reduced postnatal growth, decreased IQ, and decreased hearing. So we have enough data, and the database is large and compelling to tell us that there's a whole lot of bad things that happen when children are exposed to lead. This study looked at the legacy of blood lead levels at the population level. So in these slides, you see the average preschool blood lead level of children in the USA, France, West Germany, Italy, and Australia. And the red line is the crime rate with the offset of 20 years. So the average blood lead levels when this cohort was age 2, and the crime rate is when they were 22. And as this demonstrates, as the ambient gas levels, most of them from lead levels, most of them from gasoline, went up 20 years later, so did the crime rate. These study concluded that these countries all saw the same rise and fall of blood lead trends and crime rates that was correlated very closely to the use of gasoline in their countries. But it has a lot of impact on populations as well. So while it's a tragedy for the child and his family, if a lot of children in a population have a high blood lead level, you can look at the IQs here and you can see that in a normal population without lead exposure, the average IQ is 100. And there will be about 6 million children will have an IQ 70 and below. These are called usually educationally, mentally retarded or developmentally challenged children, and will probably need help throughout their lives. And then there will be about 6 million children with blood levels 130 or more. And these children will grow up to be gifted and are often the leaders in their communities. They are the doctors and the nurses and the policymakers. And it doesn't mean that if your IQ is 125, you're not smart. You are smart. It just takes a little longer to do things. If, however, the average IQ is shifted to the left by 5 IQ points, which is what happens when blood levels move from 2 to 10 micrograms per deciliter, there is a 57% increase in children who are considered developmentally challenged and will need help for the rest of their lives. And there is also a decrease to 2.4 million children who are considered gifted. So we've taken more than half of the leaders out of this population, and that has tremendous impacts. So the impact of blood lead level is exposure is not the same across the entire world. And it has become increasingly important in low and moderate income countries. So in countries with widespread blood lead level testing, which is certainly not all of them, average blood lead levels decline precipitously following the elimination of leaded gasoline, with ranges reported from 30 to 48% decline in average blood lead levels within 5 years. This is a tremendous, tremendous success. A 2021 study estimated that 48.5% of all children in low and middle income countries had blood lead levels greater than or equal to 5 micrograms per deciliter, versus 2% of children in affluent countries. And the economic burden of the effects of lead disproportionately affect LMICs, which lose an estimated $977 billion US per each annual birth cohort of lead-exposed children, compared to the estimated losses of $106 billion for the US and the European Union combined. Even among LMICs, the incidence and prevalence of elevated blood lead levels and the costs to the societies are not the same. In some countries, if you look here, you can see that India and China are the darkest red on this map. They have the highest average blood levels. There are places in South America where the cost is much lower, maybe 10 times lower than it is in those two countries, and the rest of the countries are ranged across. So how do children get exposed? Well, it's different. The United States is here. We're not going to talk much about the United States, but it's lead paint, lead contaminated water, consumer products, and multiple sources. You look worldwide, putting the line through lead gas was felt really good. So in 2021, Afghanistan stopped using leaded gasoline, and that was it. The end dropped the mic. There was no leaded gasoline anymore. But mining and smelting, battery repair and recycling, medications and cosmetics, and other sources, including lead paint, remain prevalent and important sources to children who live in the LMICs. In Kosovo in 2008, we did a study looking at the children who had been displaced because of the war and who were living on the land that had a former Soviet lead smelter on it. In this slide, you can see the group 1 is the average blood level of children before any work was done in terms of reducing exposures for these kids. So in the square boxes, those are families who were also doing informal smelting of batteries. And in the triangle group, there was no evidence of that. So then the second group, we had begun to do some stuff. We got them, moved them from the smelter site to another site. It was still pretty close to where the smelter was, but there were cleanable floors, and the children were able to go to school in the daytime, so got them out of a lot of the contamination. And you can see the children whose families were not smelting, their blood levels began to go down. And then the third group is just before the camps were closed and people were moved back to their original neighborhoods. And again, the group that had no smelting going on were down pretty low. I mean, they started out with a blood level of about 45, and now 2 years later, they're down to 20 micrograms per deciliter. The children living in smeltered families did not have the same success. So this is a case where there are two kinds of exposures going on, and it's very important that when we look at children, we identify and fix all of those. So this will give you an idea of what it looks like. The old smelter is the picture in the top left corner. They always look like that with a great big smokestack. The top right-hand picture, that's a computer monitor, the old kind that has a lead shield. And then the bottom picture is where you can see the burn marks that were left from people melting down the lead from that computer. So there's also lead available to children in Ayurvedic medicines and some other kinds of traditional medicines. Multiple studies have shown that the average concentration in these preparations is about 70,000 parts per billion. In many countries, these Ayurvedic medications are regulated as dietary supplements and thus do not have to require proof of safety or efficacy. And these medicines are becoming very popular worldwide, where they're thought of as more natural or somehow better than Western medicine. And a study done in South Africa looked at 8 cases of people who had been using these medications for quite a period of time. And I just want to call your attention to the blood levels of these individuals, which ranged from 34 micrograms per deciliter to 116 micrograms per deciliter. So that will tell you that there's a lot of lead. That lead is added. This is not contaminated by some, ambient thing going on. This is actually lead that is added specifically to get their blood levels up that high. We also find lead in spices. Lead is introduced into spices by contamination, which is when spices are inadvertently in contact with grinding surfaces that are made of lead or repaired with lead, or dried in open areas with high levels of ambient contamination. Lead can also be introduced to improve the appearance, usually yellow or red. And loose spices tend to be have higher lead levels than packaged or branded spices. So adulteration of this spices, again, is done purposefully. We did a study in Patna, India, where we looked at soil dust, turmeric lead levels, and blood lead levels. In the distal group of children, we looked at children who lived in neighborhoods where there was informal smelting going on. And the proximal group, I'm sorry, that's backwards. The distal group was a group that did not live in a neighborhood where smelting was going on. And the proximal group is a group which did live in that neighborhood. And you can see that the soil group in the far away, the soil lead levels in the far away group was about 35 on average. Dust wipes were low at 1.6. Turmeric was very high at 216 parts per million. And the blood lead levels were 13.1. Now, we had gone there, we had no idea about the turmeric. We were just looking for soil contamination. And in the proximal group, we found soil contamination, on average about 53 parts per million of soil. The dust wipes were a little high. The turmeric was not as high, anywhere near as high as that in the distal group. And the blood lead levels were not statistically different. So what this study tells us is that whatever benefit the children living in the neighborhood far away from the smelter had in terms of low lead exposure was wiped out by the lead exposure that they were getting in their turmeric. So once again, we have all these competing sources of lead in these children's environments and need to be able to take a look very carefully at what's going on in a particular environment. There's lead in cosmetics. The FDA in the United States has been unable to find lead in lipstick that's sold in the US. However, other researchers have found it in especially high lead levels in India and China. And the eyeliner that you see here has very high lead content. It's in many countries, it has many different names, including Kohl, Surma, Tozali, Wali, and it's used to make the baby's eyes look bright. You can see this is one bright-eyed little baby. So given the sad state of affairs and dizzying diverse number of sources, is there any reason for hope? Can we fix this? Some 15 years ago, when I lectured on global lead poisoning, my talk was entitled "A Tragic State of Neglect." However, there are recent events that are on track to change this. So global lead paint laws under the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint, which is a joint EPA-WHO initiative, has helped all these blue countries put laws in place. And that's a wonderful thing, and they're to be congratulated on that. But in a kind of a convenient sample, Pure Earth looked at whether it was possible to buy lead paint in some of these countries that had laws. And they found that, yes, in these countries, Colombia, Georgia, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Mexico, Pakistan, Philippines, Vietnam, and 3 Indian states, you could buy lead paint despite the fact that there was a law against it. So this tells us that the laws are necessary but not sufficient to ensure that lead paint is not available. We need the infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure, enforcement, and the political will for enforcement. And I know that EPA and WHO are supporting activities in these countries to help figure out the best way to enforce these laws. Public education is also important, and the availability of similarly priced, safer alternatives. And sometimes it's simply enough, and you pick up 2 cans of yellow paint. One can is lighter than the other can, right? The lighter can probably doesn't have a lot of lead. The heavier can probably does. And sometimes it can be that simple. So I have a few recommendations for some of the initial steps for folks that are developing responses to lead exposure in these low and middle income countries. The first is to make sure that the exposed community understands the hazards of lead exposure. Very often children who have high blood lead levels don't look sick, which makes it hard for people to drop everything and do something about lead. Reliance on community, political, and cultural leaders is essential when working with the project staff and the community members in the design and conduct of remediation. We found in Nigeria that when we worked with the religious leaders in an area that had high Sharia, that was very, they were living under Sharia, as long as we had deep respect for cultural norms and practices, and we had the support of the religious leaders, we were able to figure out how to do the intervention in those households without breaking any cultural norms. You need clear lines regarding the roles and responsibilities of various disciplines and agencies and expectations. It's really good to get that on paper out of the way right away. I think that these efforts, we need to put a little bit more work into creating sustainable public health programs, both to identify lead poisoned children and provide needed interventions, and also because the healthcare providers can be very, very powerful advocates. And finally, use the local residents to conduct the work wherever possible. So this is the story of battery recycling in Vietnam. This is Dong Maine, and Brett Erickson, our host here, was very involved in this. So in 213 homes, 34 were engaged in informal lead smelting, and so the fumes from the smelter went everywhere. But by the time they cleaned up the worst yards and moved the smelting activities further away from the village, the average blood lead level of the children went from 40 micrograms per deciliter to 15 micrograms per deciliter. And this cost less than $120,000 US. It was a very successful intervention in Bangladesh, where lead chromium had been introduced to make the turmeric more yellow. And this intervention, conducted over a 2-year period, they used a 3-pronged approach: the dissemination of scientific studies via the news media, educating consumers and merchants on the risks, and collaborating with the Food Safety Authority to utilize a rapid lead detection technology to enforce policy disallowing turmeric adulteration. So what happened? Well, in the pre-intervention, look at the black bar. In the pre-intervention, about almost 50% of turmeric was positive for lead. And 2 years later, a little more than 2 years later, 0% was positive for
Hi,
lead.
hi, Mary Jean. Sorry to come in. I'm getting chats. If we're running over time a little bit, if
Uh-huh. I got one more slide.
great, thank you very much.
So at the cost of $250,000, the Kings, they were able to, in 2 years, to remove this source. So we can come back to this another time. Protecting people from lead exposure is not a new idea. We have to extend previous work to LMICs and provide the resources. We know what to do. We know where to do it. We know how to do it. We should get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jean. Our next speaker is Amalia Laborde. Amalia is a medical doctor and toxicology and occupational health specialist. Sorry, one moment. She is a free professor of toxicology at the Academic Unit of Toxicology School of Medicine at the University of the Republic in Montevideo. She was the founder of the Occupational Environmental Health Toxicology Unit at the Hospital de Clínicas in 1999 in the Pediatric Environmental Toxicology Unit at the Primary Health Network of the State Administration of Health Services. She is the former director of the PAHO WHO Collaborating Center in Human Health, in Human Environmental Toxicology. She is a member of the PAHO Technical Advisory Group for the Strategy and Plan of Action on Health, Environment, and Climate Change for the Americas 2020 to 2030. She is a member of the technical group for the WHO Lead Poisoning Treatment Guidelines. She helped develop the UNICEF Children's Environmental Health Course. She is a fellow at the Collegium Ramazzini. She has her medical degree from the University of the Republic and certificates in toxicology from that university, as well as the University of Barcelona. Amalia, without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett, for your presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for the previous presentations, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Let me share with you I cannot move. Okay. To share with you some local experience about metal recovering from electric and electronic waste, that it is probably, I could say, more an increasing than emerging source of lead exposure or lead exposure, new source that appear has an important source of exposure in the last 2 decades. Electric and electronic waste is the fastest growing type of global waste. More than 50 million tons are produced or were produced in 2019, but less than 20% reach formal management or formal recycling systems. That means that more than 80% globally goes to landfills, dump sites, or informal recycling made by poor communities, as we already seen with the Sala presentation. This informal trade market, it's more important in Latin America, where less than 3% is formally managed, then more than 97% goes to landfills and dump sites. E-waste has valuable materials, and at the same time produce contamination with very hazardous chemicals. But let's see how much is the discharge of this valuable material And in this chart, we can see lead among many others contaminants or pollutants. And in 2022, according to the e-waste monitor, more than 4.4 kilotons of lead has been discharged to these landfills and dam sites. The informal recovery is made in large scales activities and in small scale activities. Most of the scientific evidence of the presence of lead and many other toxic chemicals, an unprecedented mixture of toxic chemicals, came from these large scale communities that work informally, smelting and recovering valuable materials from e-waste in China and Ghana was already mentioned, where large volumes of e-waste were processed. And we know that many intervention has been done in this areas. But in Latin America, there is an increasing dispersion of small areas, small scale recovering activities. And we have seen many hotspots of e-waste dismantling and open fire burning or incineration, smelting of this electric and electronic materials. And this hotspot has been described in many countries of Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and Uruguay. As you can see here, it's a corner of a poor neighborhood in Montevideo. There is a combination of informal activities, the poor families doing this dangerous process for a living, and middlemen who informally buy the metals, especially copper in many countries. And as you can see here is a woman smelting cables or burning cables with her child in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and an advertisement of metal that can be sold for this middleman in a neighborhood in Montevideo. There is a big concern about the children exposure because these activities are being made by families, but poor families. And there is a recent publication in 1991, in 2021, that shows that there are more than 18 million children and adolescents that may be exposed to e-waste pollution, as workers, as bystander, or environmentally exposed. And this exposure is related to many different chemicals, but most of them are neurotoxins, endocrine disruptors, and carcinogens. Lead is one of the most significant components, as we could see, of this mixture. Lead has been found 3 to 5 times higher in areas of e-waste informal recycling in air, also 100 times higher than the industrial reference level, not the residential reference level in soil. And lead doubled the reference level in rice, in rice that has been cultivated near recycling villages, and a significant proportion of elevated blood lead levels has been found among recycling communities. In Montevideo, there was a study that shows that 1 in 4 children with more than 5 micrograms per deciliter of lead were exposed to e-waste hotspots, or this e-waste hotspots was the unique or the main source of exposure. In terms of levels of blood, levels in blood levels, e-waste has the second highest exposure after paint exposure. Paint exposure is less frequent in our population, or in this population we studied, between 210 and 214. Recently, there is a review about the blood exposure in children in Montevideo. And this chart we can see that was published in the Revista de Salud Ambiental from Spain. And we can see the levels of blood, the maximum or the higher levels we found in these areas, and the source of exposure of this population. And we found between 8 and 49 micrograms per deciliter in children. In 214, there was a project to remediate an area of Montevideo called the Pantanoso Basin. It's a urban and suburban area of Montevideo. And this project was made by the City Hall of Montevideo and the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution and Pure Earth, with the participation of the Pediatric Environmental Unit of our department. And first of all, there was an identification test for understand where the hotspots were located, and the average soil lead in soil was 3,300 ppms average, and this hotspots that you can see on this map are the red points. The measurement were done with a portable instrument, the XRF, that was purchased thanks to this project. The process was remove these contaminated areas and put clean ballast, and then confirm that lead levels were under 150. And beforehand and during these activities, we held many meetings and workshops with the community, representatives of the community, the education and the health sector, and we distribute leaflets that explain the process, the risk of these hotspots of e-waste incineration, and we also give the contact with the local authorities and the pediatric environmental unit in case of suspicions of suspect exposure. The blood levels were done to 242 children and adolescents, and 68 from them had levels more than 5. That is the actual level in Montevideo, but only 38 were followed after 1 to 3 months. And the media, the geometric media was 1034 of lead in blood before the intervention, and after the intervention, the levels were 6, well, almost 7. So blood level was reduced by 3.4 micrograms deciliter after cleaning this this soil. And there were continued activities with this area in order to empower the community to take care of this cleaned space. And of course, the pediatricians and from the pediatric environmental unit evaluated and follow all the children's according to the Ministry of Health guidelines in Uruguay. These guidelines were established in 2009. So thank you very much for your attention. I will be glad to respond to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Amalia. And just a reminder for everybody in the webinar, please post your questions and comments in the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll come back to them at the end of the webinar. So we're running a little bit behind. So I think what we'll do is we'll continue with the presentations until the end of the hour, and then we'll let the Q&A run past the hour and make sure that we can close all of that out. Our next presenter is Angela Bandemir. Angela is the Acting Senior Advisor of International and Tribal Affairs to the US EPA, where she has been working on establishing and implementing effective international partnerships and projects to address global environmental issues, including air pollution, chemicals management, and lead in paint and gasoline. She is currently coordinating the US government in supporting capacity building on lead pollution in low and middle income countries. She chairs the International Lead Exposure Working Group under the U.S. President's Task Force on Environmental Health Risks and Safety Risks to Children, and the international partnership, the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. She has a master's degree in environmental engineering from Michigan State University. Angela, welcome. Thank you. The floor is yours, and I will share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Brett. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Say on lead paint, yes, indeed, we are focused on enforcement now, having moved from, we're still working on lead paint laws, and we're working on enforcement and preventing a source that can be a source for decades to come. Here today, I am talking about the UNICEF lead toolkit that EPA is helping UNICEF develop. And this is sort of the solution approach now, after you've seen all the issues that are happening and the types of sources that are existing. This is an effort to really disseminate best practices and lessons learned and case studies. Next slide, please. So we have been working with UNICEF to develop this as kind of a national capacity building tool. And now, since then, the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future was launched. So this can be a central tool for countries and how to decide to take action. The main audience for this tool is low and middle income governments. And the Partnership for Lead-Free Future partners have been supporting this and working with us through a collaborative process. EPA and UNICEF meet regularly, but we are also reaching out to collaborators who have been offering their time to help us review the tools and write the tools. We hope to finish them in a rolling process with about 6 done by this year, and then over the next year, additional tools being done for a total of 12. Next slide. So the tools are meant to be concise documents that are a compilation of existing information. That's why it's very important to involve collaborators to share the information that they've developed over time. And this can be put into a tool where we give an overview of what can be done, including case studies and links to global guidance. And each tool has a main author, and that author works with collaborators to help design and write the tool. UNICEF will host this tool on its website and will recognize authors as appropriate and will develop a generalized template. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through the 12 tools very quickly due to lack of time, but please provide any questions at the end. So there are action areas that were developed by UNICEF in 2023, and the tools answer key questions under each one of those action areas. So for the first action area to assess childhood lead exposure, there are several tools. The first one we call Tool 1, which is for understanding levels of childhood lead exposure and poisoning and its sources. And this is sort of the bottom line, what a country knows or needs to know to understand childhood lead poisoning in its borders. And this tool will provide a framework for assessing these questions, a foundational lead assessment framework. It will provide an institutional capacity assessment framework, and will provide guidance on literature searches, and we're hoping to finish this by this year. Next slide, please. The second tool is on collecting data on levels of childhood lead poisoning. How is this done? How do you do it at the small population level? And all the questions that are around this issue based on existing information and existing programs such as the US NHANES program, but also others. Next slide, please. The third tool is one that already has been developed, and the link here is a live hyperlink, which you'll get when you get the presentations. And this is a tool on how to assess lead, environmental lead exposure, and the key considerations for this, what you need to do to make it happen, how do you plan it, how do you carry out a risk assessment, etc. And so this one is complete and available on the website. Next slide, please. Tool 4 is a very helpful tool to help countries look across the various ministries and institutions and develop a whole of government approach, which has been a successful approach. And this is to help countries develop essentially an action plan of who to work with. And I apologize if I have unstable network. Tool 5 is about communicating about lead, and EPA is developing that with UNICEF. Tool 6, next slide, is on health systems capacity and how to build that. Tool 7 is for lead surveillance system that's a little more smaller scale, like at the household level. Tool 8 is looking at regulations and what regulations need to be passed, and with case studies for each. Next. Tool 9 is in occupational settings. Next. Tool 10 is looking at environmental protection capacity, really more regulatory capacity, what capacity is needed across the government to regulate. Next slide. Tool 11 is focused on lead acid batteries, and here I'd like to highlight that we're also going to be producing a companion model regulation that's modeled after the regulation we did for lead in paint, to hoping to have some on-the-ground impact here. Next. Tool slide is on remediation. Tool 12, and then last. So we really welcome collaboration, sharing your research, sharing your information. And if you'd like to get involved in developing this toolkit, please contact either myself or Brett. Thank you very much.
Angela, thank you very much. So as a reminder, please place your questions in the Q&A window, and I'll just share one more slide here on the proposed webinar series. This is a tentative list of the webinars that are forthcoming. As you can see, they roughly mirror the topics that Angela just presented in the toolkit. The exact timing of each of these webinars will be shared in future newsletters, but this is something to look forward to.